Well, they're looking for Breege's reading, what's she talking about now? And so I'm on to Facebook. That's how I know the brilliant stuff that she puts up and that we can all comment on and see. And it's we give out about modern technology, but it is one of the great ways of Facebook. I don't know whether it's for us, you have to be slightly older or what, but it definitely keeps lots of historical information going and sets you off in different directions. And Breege, that's what you're doing, is pointing out at things and commenting on things, and it's great. It's a wonderful way of keeping in touch with each other. So now we've travelled out to Ackle, we've seen all those engines and things, and that brought back that childhood love of trains. I don't know if it was just boys, I'm sure there were lots of girls who loved trains and railways and so on and so forth. But now we're back in Newport, and we're down in O'Malley's to some extent, O'Malley's Transport, which is based down there at the old workhouse. And Breege is going to talk to you about the Poor Law Union itself and about the workhouse. So Breege, over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. So between the microphone here and this doodah thing here and the screen behind me and the screen in front of me, if I get a bit confused, you might understand. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share some of my research with you on Newport Poor Law Union and the workhouse at Derrylone. It's a largely forgotten part of our local history, and to my way of thinking, it merits a public memorial or a commemorative marker of some kind. Now, that's a conversation for another day, but I throw it out there as a forethought to my few words today. I went through quite a few sources to look for information about the union and the workhouse, and I put up a couple of the main ones here. In particular, with regard to today's presentation, I'd like to acknowledge Claire Lowry from the Irish Workhouse Centre in Portumna for a number of photographs that I'll be using today. And I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Aisling O'Malley in Knocknageeha and the O'Malley family from Derrylone for their very kind assistance in facilitating my research on the workhouse. So a tiny bit of background. The Poor Relief Ireland Act of 1838 extended the poor law provision in existence in Britain to Ireland, and subsequent legislation then modified and extended the role of the Poor Law Union in Ireland. The legislation set up the background for the network of poor law unions and workhouses in Ireland, which formed the official government response to destitution, poverty, and the series of famines which persisted throughout the remainder of the 19th century. The poor law unions were under the authority of the Poor Law Commissioners based in Dublin, and they set all the policy and the regulation for the unions and the workhouses. They provided no funding practically except in the form of loans, which had to be repaid in full and in a quite timely manner. Following the 1838 legislation, a first phase of workhouses was built around the country with their the unions were formed with their associated workhouses. And in Mayo, these were based in Ballina, Ballinrobe, Castlebar, Swinford and Westport. Following an 1848 Boundaries Commission review, a number of second phase unions and workhouses opened at locations in the country. And in Mayo, the second phase unions were based at Belmullet, Killala, Claremorris and Newport. And Newport Union operated from 1849 to 1885. Sorry, is that interfering with sound? I wonder if I tried without the microphone? Does my voice stretch to the back of the room?
Yes. Yes.
Can you hear me, Mary?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, that's that. Super. One last thing. So the role or the responsibility of the Poor Law Union was to provide indoor or workhouse relief and outdoor relief for the paupers in its area. And paupers were defined as those in receipt of poor law relief or relief from other charitable organisations or institutions. The first meeting of Newport Poor Law Union was held on October 15, 1849. It was attended by the Marquis of Sligo from Westport, Richard O'Donnell from Newport House, and James Hillis from Maryland.
Prior to 1849, the area that comprised Newport Union was under Westport Union, which by the late 1840s was coming under severe pressure in terms of demands upon it. The Newport Union area covered from Achill all the way out to Newport, bringing in Ballycroy, Shermore, and Newport and some of the electoral districts to the south and to the east of it. And from 1858, Glenhast came in under Newport Union as well. Prior to the setting up of the permanent workhouse at Derrylone Beg, Newport Union operated a temporary workhouse from about 1850 to 1852. There were two properties involved. They were both in Melcombe adjoining properties. One was house and offices at Seamount, which was later to become Melcombe House, and a house and sheds at Melcombe as well, both of which had been successfully tendered to the union by Richard O'Donnell. Construction of the workhouse at Derrylone Beg began as soon as possible. This is the notice which appeared in the local newspapers. It's dated February 1st, 1850, and it invited tenders from builders and others for the construction of the workhouse at Derrylone Beg. The tendering and approval process moved along very quickly because approval was granted by the commissioners in March 1850, and building started shortly thereafter on the site at Derrylone Beg. The site had been offered by Richard O'Donnell in 1849. The contractor hired was Patrick Brown, and the buildings and the fittings were completed at a cost of £5,965. The workhouse opened in 1852 with accommodation for 500 persons. And from everything that I've seen in regard to workhouse residency numbers, it would suggest that the workhouse residency numbers never exceeded the maximum provision at any time. This is from the Lawrence collection. Lawrence was in Mayo in the 1890s. By then, the Poor Law Union in Newport had closed, but the workhouse complex and the buildings remained standing. Now, this photograph isn't very much of help to you by way of close-up detail. It's the only photograph that I'm aware of that shows anything of the workhouse. But if you look along the tree line there, and if you can make it out from where you are, you can see some roofs and some chimneys just popping up above the tree line there. And those are the buildings of the workhouse complex. Now, like I said, no help to you in terms of close-up detail, but it does give you a very good idea of the striking and imposing buildings that were part of the workhouse complex in the location there in Derrylone Beg, just off to the right as you head for Achill, out of Newport. If you'd like to have a closer look at this, there is the relevant extract of the photograph appears in the Newport 300 book, and it's also on display at the foot of the viaduct on Castlebar Road. The workhouse architect was George Wilkinson. He was a British architect, and he was employed by the commissioners to draw up the plans for the first phase of workhouses, and then he was retained for doing the plans for the second phase workhouses. The difference between the first and second phase was very little. Wilkinson moved away from the somewhat ornate design of the first phase workhouses, and he focused in particular on reduction of damp and improvement in ventilation for the second phase workhouses. There are generic plans for the workhouses, and then there were also location-specific plans drawn up for example, in Newport, in Borrisokane, in Portumna. And in effect, they varied very, very little. So that if you combine a look at the generic plans with a look at, say, the plans for Portumna, for example, you get a very good idea of the operation and the layout at Derrylone Beg. Now, the plans for Derrylone Beg are not available to the public. They're in the Irish Architectural Archive. They're very fragile, and they're just not made available at all to the public. And before I move on, if you just pause for a moment and look at the layout, as it were. So here you'd have the entrance to the workhouse, and you'd have this first row of buildings here, second two-story row of buildings. And then separated then by a yard, you have a second row of buildings. This was a three-story row of buildings. And then at the back then another row, this was another two-story row of buildings. And then you have along the external walls and the end wall, you have some operational areas as well that I hope that I'll get to as I go along. So if you think, again, just briefly to bring it back to the first line here, if you stand, as it were, looking into the workhouse, to your left then along here would be what I suppose I would call a number of front of house areas. This is where, on the left then, this is where the Board of Guardians had their meeting room. There was also a waiting hall here, and this is where the clerk had his offices. Now the guardians were, for the most part, usually they were unpaid officials, but they were a corporate body and they had legally binding responsibilities. They were elected, or they could be re-elected, by the poor law rate taxpayers in the union. All justices of the peace, by virtue of their office, were required to be guardians, members of the board, and no minister of religion of any denomination could be a member of the Board of Guardians. So for the most part they were either very large landowners or landholders, which is ironic really in some ways, because some of these very people would have been in the first instance responsible for the issues that the Poor Law Union was trying to deal with. The guardians were responsible for the overall operation of the union and the provision of its services. They set the poor law rates and they provided for the collection of those if they could. And this was very important because this was really the only source of funding for the union for all of its operation. And as well as that too, in terms of the residents who came to seek shelter in the workhouse, they had to officially approve all of the applicants to the workhouse. In the waiting hall area, the applicants who were waiting to have a decision on their admission application, they waited to hear what the decision of the guardians was. And also in the waiting hall, persons who had come along maybe to attend a part of the meeting also waited in the waiting hall until they were called in. And equally so, newspaper reporters now, the meetings were held behind closed doors, so certainly there were no newspaper reporters, but sometimes newspaper reporters came along either in the expectation of receiving official announcements from the guardians, or else just simply to attend at the workhouse and to observe, and so they reported on this in the course of their work. The clerk's office too was at the front of house. The union was served by two clerks throughout its operation. The first of these was Dodwell Brown, who served from 1849 to 1883. He lived with his family at Sandymount, and by all accounts he was very popular and very well liked man. And then after his retirement in 1883, a clerk called A. Cecil Fenton served the union from then until its closure in 1885. Now, if you think about the first row of buildings there that I showed you earlier, and if you're standing there looking towards the gates, and if you think about to the right-hand side then of that row of buildings, that's where you found the rooms and accommodation that the master had. And if the master and the matron were married, well then she too shared that accommodation. The master was responsible for all aspects of the running of the operational, the day-to-day running of the workhouse, and he had specific duties in regard to the male residents and also in regard to those who fell ill and who died in the workhouse. He was assisted by a number of staff members whom I'll mention briefly as I go along. It was common practice in workhouses throughout the country for the master and the matron to be a married couple, and we know that the first master and matron for Newport Union were a married couple, a Mrs. and Mr. Johnson. Now later on we know that some other workhouse masters were James Walsh, Patrick McManaman and Henry Mahoney, and we have these names from the Porrigo Moron folklore collection. There could have been others, but these are the only names that I came upon in my research. And I neglected to mention earlier that there are two buildings, and there's one outdoor area that survive at the location of the workhouse. And one of these would have been where the master had his, it's a two-story building, and it's where the master would have had his day rooms and his accommodation overhead. And that's the building, that the most easterly of the two buildings that survives at that site still. Now the matron, even if she were married to the master, she still had her own separate rooms. They were to the left in the second line of buildings on the ground floor. And she had these rooms because she had supervisory duties, specifically in regard to the women and the children. And if she had to do night duty, even if she were married to the master, she still would have to do night duty, so she still had her base to do her work from. And her room was located so as to effectively supervise the yards and the accommodation. She assisted the master in all of his work, and in his absence she was fully responsible for the workhouse. She had specific duties in regard to the supervision of the female residents and in regard to the children, and she supervised the making and the mending and supply of linen and clothing. She also had duties in regard to the cleaning and the ventilation of the dormitories, the supervision of the provision of meals and such things. Here's a photograph from the Irish Workhouse Centre in Portumna, which kind of reproduces, I suppose, if you like, what the matron's sleeping quarters would have looked like. So quite sparse, as you can see, but certainly with a degree of privacy and dignity that you don't see in the dormitory accommodation, which you'll see in a moment. One of the, for me, a kind of fascinating operational areas of the workhouse was the laundry area. And you can imagine that a workhouse, regardless of the number of residents in it, would have had a huge volume of laundry. And it's the residents, or in the contemporary term, the inmates, who worked at this, and sometimes the older children helped. Now, the laundry area was located on the left-hand, along the left-hand side of the complex, against the external wall of the female yards. And it comprised of three sections, if you like. A washing area where there were two 200-gallon boilers, 9 washing troughs, and a graduated vent in the roof and vents in the floor. So you can imagine how much muscle work that would have taken to operate the, go through the laundry and the washing troughs, etc. All of that. The second section then, just adjacent to it, was the folding room. And there you had a stove and you had a folding board that ran the length of one wall of the section. And finally then you had the airing room. And this was located again immediately adjacent to the folding room, which was up a flight of stairs from the folding room, and it contained metal clothes horse rails extended above a grated metal floor. And the heat for drying the items came from a furnace below that, from which the heat came then up through the pipes and the railings and provided the heat for drying. This is a reconstructed smoke and air vent in the washroom in Portumna, and the smoke from the furnace, the heating and all of that would have worked its way up through, from the area up through that, and any steam coming from the sections would also work its way up through there. In this area there were also channels or vents in the floor which allowed for the runoff of water or steam either. This is again a representation from the workhouse in Portumna of what the drying area would have looked like. So if you can imagine for yourself if you can try to picture maybe extending back from this railing here, metal rails extending back and attached to the wall at the back, that's where items would be placed then for drying. And the furnace was below here, you can see the metal gratings, the open gratings, and the furnace was below this, and the heat then came up through that to dry the items. And you also had items folded across or laid across the wooden railings there. And it seems like there was a second railing here, well maybe a partial one, suggested there by those holes in the floor there, that might suggest a second railing along there as well. The furnace was supplied by turf all day long. Turf was, there were 2 women assigned to throw in the turf to fill the furnace all day for the heating there, and sometimes the children again assisted with that work. Now, when you pull together the bits and pieces that I came across in the different sources of information in regard to the operational areas of the workhouse and the operation in general, and you fit that with the generic maps or the maps from Portumna, for example, which are similar, then you usually get a fairly cohesive picture that all fits together of the various operational areas of the workhouse. But with regard to the bakehouse at Derry Low and Beg, kind of posed a bit of a puzzle, presented a kind of a question mark to me. In Portumna, the bakehouse was a flagged area containing a boiler and a large, almost circular oven, and it was located on the right-hand external wall of the complex, behind the second line of buildings, if you can picture that, then to the right of that against the external wall, along the external wall of the men's yard. In 1850, we know that Newport Union purchased 8 cast metal boilers from the Eagle Foundry in Glasgow. That was the business of John and Ebenezer Crawford. And if you take the drawings into consideration, then you can be fairly sure that one of those cast metal boilers was for the bakehouse, and that it was intended that a bakehouse would be part of the construction at Derry Low and Beg. However, Newport Union consistently outsourced its bread supplies, and we know that it regularly advertised for suppliers of bread of different kinds. We know, we learn again from Corrigal Moran in the folklore collection, we learned that at one point during its operation, Lund's Bakery in Georgia Street in Newport supplied the bread to the workhouse. And we learned that James Callaghan, who was one of Lund's employees, it was his responsibility to carry out the bread in a creel or a creeve on his back out to the workhouse in Derry Low and Beg. Now, there were deviations at local level, particularly in regard to bakehouses in workhouses throughout the country. And sometimes the use was modified or changed, or they were just closed off and they weren't operated for one reason or another. And really, we don't really know the full story. It's quite a bit of a puzzle there with regard to the bakehouse in Derry Low and Beg. Perhaps the union found it more cost efficient just to outsource the bread, or maybe the occupancy levels just didn't warrant using the bakehouse. There's one other thing that, just again to kind of muddle the story, is that while the union outsourced its bread supplies, it did purchase baking goods, so for example flour. Now the flour could have been used in the preparation of meals in the kitchen, could have been used for example in soup, or maybe baked goods were produced in the kitchen, but really for me the bakehouse is one of the kind of unknowns of the workhouse story. So if I bring you back to the front line of the workhouse, if you remember those 3 lines that I had earlier, we bring you back to the front line there, to the front of house area. If persons presented and applied for admission to the workhouse, the regulation from the commissioners, established by the commissioners, was that the whole family had to enter together. And if they had to wait, which was usually the case, if they had to wait for the formal approval of the Board of Guardians, well then they were admitted to what were called probationary wards while they awaited for the approval. And at this stage, initially, the women and the girls were admitted to the probationary wards along the left-hand side of that first row of buildings, and the boys and the men then had their probationary ward on the right-hand side. At this point, the applicants, they were stripped, they were bathed, they underwent a medical examination, they were issued with workhouse clothing. Their own clothing was taken off them, and then afterwards it was washed and it was stored in a closed storage area adjacent to the probationary wards. And if at any time then later on they were to leave the workhouse for any reason, well then they were reissued with their own clothes, and obviously the workhouse clothing was returned. And just a small point on that very briefly, if I may. Later on, when the union was under financial stress and the funding was very low, at one point it actually advertised for the sale of rags from its closed doors as a means of trying to get in any kind of funding that they could. So they were selling off the clothes that had been left there in the closed door over the decades. Just again, in regard to the surviving areas of the complex at Derry Loan Bay, the female probationary ward yard, so with each probationary ward there was a yard associated with it, and the yard has survived, not the actual part of the building, but the yard has survived, and the privies or the toilets that were in that area have also survived. Now, then if they were formally admitted, the applicants then were assigned their dormitory areas, and it was practiced throughout the country that the able-bodied, the infirm and the aged would all be allocated different wards in different parts of the dormitories. And at this stage then, the applicants experienced the very, very strict segregation that you had in the workhouse. So the men and women were separated, the boys and girls were separated from one another and from their parents. In 1861, George O'Donnell, not George, his father, Richard O'Donnell gave testimony to the House of Commons in London. And as part of that testimony, he pretty much boasted that in Derry Loan Beg, in the Newport Union, they allowed the children to stay with their mothers up to the age of 4. Now, the regulation from the commissioners was that the children could only remain with their mothers up to the age of 2. O'Donnell stated that this was far more, it's another word to use, but far more humane, and that it made for happier children and for happier mothers. That was O'Donnell's statement to the House of Commons on that one. Then in terms of accommodation on the dormitories, the boys and girls had their accommodation on the first floor of the first line of buildings, and that was just above the schoolrooms. And just again, in terms of the last mention I'll make of the surviving buildings, because you had the 2 buildings, remember the masters' quarters there to the east of the complex, and then on the western end of the complex then, the westerly surviving building was dormitory 2 in the workhouse complex, and was the girls' dormitory. Now the adult dormitory accommodation was on the first and second floors of the second row of buildings. Remember that was a 3-story structure. And behind that then again you had the infirmary day wards and the yards associated with those. Now to the left, on the left, you can have gathered now that all the left hand side was pretty much for the women and the females, and the right for the males, etc. So to the left then, in that line of buildings there on the ground floor, the nurse had rooms, and to the right, the doctor, or sometimes referred to as a surgeon, or the medical officer, he had a room there, his base for working in the infirmary. And Newport Poor Law Union employed just 2 medical officers or doctors during the course of his operation. From 1850 to 1874, he was Dr. James Davis, and then he was succeeded by his son, Dr. Hugh A. Davis, from 1874 to the end of its operation. There was separate access to the yard for each dormitory area. So the men had their yard, the children, the boys had their yard, the girls had their yard, the women had their yard. And in each yard area there were privies and toilets, and there were wells, and it's to be noted that the wells were not for the personal use of the residents. They weren't for drinking water or any such thing. They were to be used for the operational areas of the workhouse, which made huge demands on the water supplies. You can imagine the laundry, the boilers, etc. Here is a photograph of the surviving wall between the male and the female yards and wards at Portumna. And I mean, it speaks for itself, but to me it's a very strong visual representation of the human experience of segregation and division of any kind, whether it be physical, cultural, social, emotional, personal, whatever. That's what it says to me there. Here is a reconstruction, if you like, of what the dormitory area at Portumna would have looked like. And remember, it would have been the very same in Derryloanbeg. So each of the dormitories would have this line of straw-fill mattresses there lined up on the raised platform. Residents would have been issued with sheets and blankets, and in the children's dormitories, if there was a demand, overcrowding or anything like that, a number of smaller children would have shared a single mattress. Then there were the chamber pots for each individual set in the lower channel there, along there. Of course, these had to be emptied every day, and that was usually the duty of the younger children. To the back then, oops, sorry, do it again. Further, you can see there, through that door then, there was another dormitory area there, very similar setup. Then at the very back of the complex, positioned centrally along the back wall, was the dead house, or the mortuary, in other words. In the second phase design, the graveyard, the graveyard was separate to the workhouse complex. Now, in the first phase designs, the graveyard was adjacent to and almost integrated into the complex. Now, I haven't come upon any historical maps which indicate a graveyard at Derryloanbeg, but the local tradition holds that it is there in the top right hand corner of the site, as it were, where you have the graveyard. The figures for deaths in the workhouse in Newport, they're really incomplete, and any that I've been able to find have varied greatly. If I just give you two examples, the first one from the year 1850. We know that between December 8, 1849 and April 27, 1850, 88 persons from Newport Union died in Westport Workhouse. Now remember, Newport Union didn't have a workhouse at that stage yet, and persons from Newport Union were still being looked after in the Westport Workhouse. And any persons from the Newport Union accommodated in Westport Workhouse in that period, Newport Union had to pay for the cost of the accommodation for those persons. They were from their union area, even though they were being looked after in Westport. Newport Union still was required to pay the expenses involved there, and also to keep all sorts of very detailed figures and accounts and such things. The other figure I have for you is from 1878, and it's a figure that I collated myself really by going through the irishgenealogy.ie death details, and I looked through to see what I could find of deaths registered as having occurred at the workhouse. And for that year, it wasn't any scientific kind of a study. But for that year, I only found details of 15 residents having died at the workhouse. So you can see the great variation there, up and down. So when we think for a moment about life in the workhouse, it was an intentionally harsh regime, and this was this applied throughout the country. The commissioners, God forbid, they didn't want to make the workhouse option look appealing in any way at all, so they enforced it was a very harsh regime enforced. Richard O'Donnell, again to the House of Commons, he described the workhouse as orderly and clean, and a number of different sources described it as well ventilated. Now, thinking about Richard O'Donnell, he'd be very careful. He wouldn't want to let the side down, so he'd be putting up the good side, as it were. But newspaper reporters who attended at the workhouse, they reported cold brick floors, often no fires lit. And then when you think about the physical environs, and you think about, say, in the dormitories, body odours, chamber pots, outside surface drains, there were 3 of them. They ran the width of the complex at different points. They were open surface drains. And then you had the privies, toilets, and then you had cesspools. And the cesspools were open sewage pits, you could call them, really. And when you think about that environment, and you think about how unpleasant all of that would have been, there was a very strict regimen of routine enforced in the workhouse, and there were very lengthy strictly enforced periods of silence. So if you found yourself, if you were a resident in the workhouse, and just think about it, during these enforced periods of silence, the sound of the workhouse would be the sounds of nature. Wind, birds, rain, the sound of implements maybe being used somewhere in the complex, or perhaps the distant sounds from the town for lengthy periods during the day. The day began and ended with prayer. The adults worked, the women, the cleaning, the cooking, sewing, food preparation. The main job of the men, and this was what happened in workhouses throughout the country, the men's job was to break stone, and the stone was used in the construction of roads locally. And at one point during the operation of the Newport Workhouse, there were no able-bodied men available to break stone. So the women and the children would put to the work at pains of forfeiting their evening, their meal, if they didn't do what they were asked to do there. Any kind of ill discipline or anything like that was punishable by being sent to the refractory wards. Maybe help needed here. Is that moving?
You can't move down.
Sorry, Peter. There's some message here I don't want to. Something here. Sorry, thanks, Peter. So, if you stepped out of line, you were sent to the refractory wards, and I show you, before I get to the refractory wards, I just show you this from Portumna. It's part of the surviving structure in Portumna. That's your cesspool, and you can see here you have the open area here below the wall, some nice stonework there. And this area then was fronted by pieces of timber into which holes were cut for the toilet seats, and the toilet waste then made its way down beneath. That's the external wall, and made its way down there, and happened whatever happened to it. This is the infirmary day room, as it would have been depicted in Portumna, and I show it to you because you might be able to make out the bricks, cold bricks, remember they were described as. And also you can see the fireplace there, and when you think about the size of the room, high ceilings, the width of the room, that kind of fire isn't going to provide much warmth in a room like that, and they were all like that. This then is a wider view of the cesspool. You can see it here. And then to the left here would have been a toilet, and to the right here were the refractory wards. And you can see how narrow, such narrow spaces they were. You can see this area here, this stone area here was where for the bed. And when you think about the cold and the damp and the darkness and the discomfort, and then you think about a miscreant having to spend hours or days locked up in the refractory wards like that. That was the reality of it, really. Now the kitchen area was a central block opposite the main entrance, and it was accessed across one of these, it was actually a paved surface drain, that one of these that ran the whole width of the complex. The kitchen was a flagged area. It had 3 boilers, it had a large sink, it had shelving and dressers for implements and storage and such things. And the fuel came from the main fuel store along the external wall of the men's yard, so just adjacent to it. I couldn't find any reference to a cook in any of the sources about Derrylow and Beg, so one could safely assume really that the preparation of meals was undertaken by the women under the supervision of the matron, probably. Newport Union advertised at regular intervals for suppliers of foods of different kinds, both everyday foods and luxury foods. So the luxury foods would have been, say, like cocoa, flummery, and different types of alcohol. There was no mention of potatoes in the food orders until the 1870s, and there was a view among the Newport guardians that potatoes were expensive, they required a lot of work and preparation, and they brought filth, is the word used, to the workhouse. I suppose that's with regard to maybe discarding waste and peas and whatnot. In 1861, again, O'Donnell to the House of Commons, he stated that the workhouse provided good quality bread and milk, in particular to the children. He described the food for the children as good, and then his comment was that for the other inmates it was equally as good. Now, he described the food for the children in some detail, so he talked about portions of bread, milk, a veal broth. He didn't go into the details of the adult meals, but the mainstay of the general workhouse diet in all workhouses around the country was the workhouse soup, which the residents got twice a day. And the commissioners dictated the recipe and the portions for the soup. And for most of the time, the soup consisted of ground barley, peas, pepper, salt and water, all cooked up in the workhouse soup pot. And looking at the food orders for Derrylow and Beg, I suspect that turnip might have been added to the soup there because they were ordered in really large quantities. And it wasn't until late in the second half of the 19th century that the food diet in general improved in workhouses, and you can see that reflected in the food orders then from for Newport Union. So around that time, residents began to get bread portions. Now they got small portions of bread with the soup anyway from the beginning, but then they got additional bread portions then in the later years of the system. And that's when they began to get tea as part of their meal, and they began to get a meat soup dinner, so later on in the operation of the workhouses countrywide. And you can see that, like I said, reflected in what we read about Newport Union. Now, immediately behind the kitchen area was the dining hall area, where very carefully enforced segregation continued. And behind that again was the chapel. And the chapel area was separated from the dining hall area, usually by a curtain. That's the way it was in Portumna, and that's probably the way it was in Derrylow and Beg. Just maybe a couple of things about the chapel, I suppose, and the chaplaincy. Newport Union employed a Protestant chaplain at a rate of £12 a year, and a Catholic chaplain at a rate of £50 a year. And in 1864, we can read reports of the visit of Archbishop John McHale to the workhouse. He was in Newport, at Newport Chapel for a confirmation, and he came out to visit the workhouse. He was courteously welcomed, is the word used, courteously, and he was very happy with everything he saw there. Then, from 1877, we read about a very heated debate that went on at the Board of Guardians meetings, due to the suggestion that the Protestant chaplain would have his pay reduced, or indeed that perhaps the position should be discontinued altogether. Now, quite a heated debate, but in the end of it all, the status quo was retained. Now, in the minds of a lot of people, the role of the workhouse was to provide accommodation and food for the destitute. But in the minds of many of the officials and the people who were on the side of providing and operating the workhouses, and in the words of the Poor Law Inspector Richard Burke here from 1856, the principal matter in connection with the workhouse is the education of the children. It was prioritising education over the other roles that you saw the workhouse as having. The school rooms were located to the front of the complex on the ground floor, and the union employed a schoolmaster, a schoolmistress and a shoemaker, and his job was to instruct the boys in the skill of shoemaking so that they would have a vocation. O'Donnell told the House of Commons that the union got its teachers from the nuns in Galway, as he put it, and we know from the few union records that we have that the first schoolmistress was called Catherine Kelly. Now, O'Donnell boasted again that the children from the workhouse got such a good education that they were very quickly taken up as tutors in the houses of the landed gentry, or they went out to service in those houses. Some of the children made their way, they found their way eventually to relatives. Some of them died and some of them emigrated, which would probably be the story for, some of them left the workhouse and then returned. It's the same story for the adults as well. So then, just moving on quickly to the closure of the union. There was particularly severe distress in Mayo in the late 1870s and the early 1880s. All landholders under £4 poor law valuation were exempt from paying poor law tax. And in Newport Union at that time, 75% of the holdings were under £4 valuation. So by the end of 1879, there were grievously deteriorating circumstances and there were increased demands, hugely increased demands on the union. And in 1880, the commissioners, in their wisdom, they dissolved the board and they put in paid officials. And their job pretty much was to tidy up the mess. And it worked for a little while. They reduced the salaries of the workhouse officials and union officials. They raised the rates. They tried to collect the taxes. And just the taxpayers just didn't have the money and they just didn't pay it. And from 1876, the question of amalgamation had begun to arise in a number of quarters. In August 1885 came the order from local government to the board dissolving the union, and within a year of closure the former workhouse had been put up for sale by Westport Union. Now it was amalgamated with Westport, so it was now in the ownership of Westport Union. It took quite a while for it to be sold, and in fact in the end it was all dismantled except for the surviving units that I talked about. It was pretty much dismantled and it was sold off in parcels, the slates, the stone, the timbers, the metal, whatever. It was sold off like that in the end. But the site itself then came in under the Congested District Board about 1905, and then under the Irish Land Commission about 1925, and then shortly thereafter it came into private ownership, and it's remained that location is. The property there has remained in private ownership ever since. So there's a quick run through some of my findings about the Newport Union and the workhouse at Derry Lone Leg. Apologies if I've overrun my time allocation, but if you want to read anything a little bit further, or you want to have a run through the information that I've just presented there today, chapter 10 in the Newport 300 book is my work on this particular topic. So thanks very much.